Everyone thought he was dead, until his 2-year-old daughter screamed what no one expected. At the quiet funeral held in the dimly lit St. Helena Church, mourners filled the pews, their faces solemn beneath the flickering candlelight. Among them stood Eliza, dressed in black, clutching her 2-year-old son, Noah, tightly against her chest. The boy had been crying non-stop since morning, his cheeks flushed and eyes swollen. But it wasn't just grief that stirred him, it was something else. As the priest recited a prayer beside the casket where Adam, Eliza's husband, lay motionless, Noah suddenly pulled away from his mother's embrace. His tiny hand pointed at the wooden coffin with trembling fingers. "Daddy, Daddy is calling," he sobbed, his voice breaking the heavy silence. A few people in the front rows turned, puzzled. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She bent down to comfort her son, whispering softly, "It's okay, baby. Daddy's sleeping now." But Noah shook his head furiously, tears streaking down his round cheeks. "No, Mama, he's not sleeping. He's calling me. He's trapped," he cried louder. A chilling breeze drifted through the church, making the candles flicker, as if reacting to his words. The atmosphere shifted instantly. What was supposed to be a peaceful farewell became thick with unease. Whispers rippled through the mourners. Some looked at Noah with pity, others with a flicker of fear. And as the little boy kept pointing at the coffin, repeating, "Daddy is calling," again and again, a strange sense of dread crept into the room, tightening around Eliza's chest. Her instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where we bring you the most emotional, powerful, and unforgettable real-life stories that shine through even the darkest moments. If you're someone who believes in the strength of love, the triumph of truth, and the resilience of the human spirit, then you're in the right place. Before we dive into today's moving story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Cracks of Light. Your support means the world to us and gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more meaningful and inspiring content. Eliza tried to brush off the chill that crept up her spine, telling herself that Noah was just a confused little boy trying to process the loss of his father. But deep down, something didn't feel right. His words, so clear, so insistent, refused to leave her mind. "Daddy is calling. He's trapped." They weren't the random mutterings of a grieving toddler. There was a strange urgency in his voice, a fear that seemed far too real for a child who barely understood death. As the mourners slowly began to disperse to the back of the church, murmuring prayers and offering soft condolences, the heavy doors creaked open once more. A tall man stepped in, dressed in a sharply pressed black suit. His name was Daniel, Adam's cousin. His expression was somber, yet something about his demeanor felt rehearsed, like a man trying too hard to wear sorrow. He walked straight to Eliza, his dark eyes shifting toward the casket only briefly before resting on her. "You must be exhausted," he said, voice low and syrupy. "I can't imagine what you're going through." Eliza nodded slightly, still cradling Noah, who had buried his face into her shoulder but hadn't stopped trembling. "He keeps saying Adam is calling," she whispered, almost afraid of how absurd it sounded. Daniel offered a tight, uncomfortable smile. "Poor kid, he's just confused. Children at that age don't understand what's going on. Sometimes their minds invent ways to cope." But his eyes didn't match the calmness in his voice. They flickered with something else, discomfort, maybe even guilt. Then, without skipping a beat, Daniel continued, "Look, Eliza, I hate to bring this up now, but Adam left behind quite a bit of debt. Creditors have already reached out. The house, it might be best to consider selling it before things spiral." Eliza's breath caught. "What?" she asked, stunned. "You're talking about selling our home? At his funeral?" Daniel raised his hands, feigning sympathy. I know how it sounds. But timing matters in situations like this. I'm just thinking about what's best for you and Noah. I could help you handle the legal side." Noah suddenly jerked his head up. His wide eyes scanned the darkened corners of the church, then locked on the coffin again. "Mommy," he whimpered, pointing with a trembling finger. "Daddy's still in there. He's crying." Eliza stiffened. She looked at Daniel, who now stood eerily still, his jaw clenched slightly. The room grew heavier, as if the very air were thickening with dread. Some of the remaining guests glanced over, unsettled by the child's claim, An old woman near the back of the room, a neighbor named Mrs. Whitmore, made the sign of the cross. Whispering, "Children, sometimes they see what we cannot." Eliza tried to steady her breath, to rationalize the chaos brewing inside her mind. Noah was grieving. He didn't understand death, that's all. But Daniel's reaction didn't go unnoticed. She watched him closely, his sudden tight-lipped silence. The way his fingers drummed nervously against the wooden pew. "It's just grief," he muttered quickly, almost too quickly. "Don't let his words scare anyone. He's not lying." Eliza replied softly, but firmly. "He's never spoken like this before. It's not like him." Daniel didn't answer. He just shifted his weight from one foot to the other, visibly uneasy. Noah's voice pierced the silence again, more desperate this time. "He's trapped. Mommy, he's calling you. Why won't anyone listen?" His cries echoed through the church, louder than the bells outside. A few guests exchanged alarmed glances. Someone whispered, "Maybe they should check the coffin." "Absolutely not," Daniel snapped, his voice suddenly sharper. He quickly softened his tone when eyes turned toward him. "I just mean, this is no time for superstition. Adam is gone. Let him rest." But Eliza wasn't so sure anymore. The timing, the way Daniel brought up the house like it was a business deal. The way he tensed whenever Noah spoke. The way his smile never quite reached his eyes. "How do you know?" she asked quietly. "Were you there when he passed?" Daniel blinked. "Of course not. I was out of town. But the doctor confirmed it." "You were there. I saw him, but I never." Eliza hesitated. She realized that in her grief, she had never really questioned it. The doctor barely spoke. The paperwork had been rushed. Could they have missed something? Or worse, had something been hidden? Noah sobbed again, burying his face in her shoulder. "He's scared. Mommy, Daddy's scared. He wants to come home." Eliza's blood ran cold. She turned her gaze to the coffin, its polished surface now seeming more like a prison than a resting place. The room that once held soft prayers now vibrated with hushed dread. The whispers grew. "Maybe the child's right. What if he's not really gone? Could it be?" Daniel's voice cut through like a knife. "Enough. This is all just emotion talking. I'll come by tomorrow to talk about the house." And with that, he turned and left, his shoes clicking loudly against the stone floor. But Eliza remained frozen, her arms wrapped tightly around her son, her heart pounding. She didn't have answers. She only had Noah's trembling voice, her own rising fear and a deep, undeniable sense that something inside that coffin wasn't at rest. The stillness in St. Helena Church grew heavier with every passing second. A place once meant for solemn prayer had turned into a cradle of unease, with every candle flicker now casting shadows that felt alive. Whispers floated through the mourners like smoke, thin, ominous, impossible to grasp but impossible to ignore. "Did you hear what the child said? She keeps pointing to the coffin. Maybe something's wrong." Eliza stood frozen in the aisle, her arms wrapped tightly around little Noah. The boy's sobs had quieted but his small body continued to tremble against her chest. He stared straight ahead, eyes locked on the coffin where his father lay. His voice, soft but chilling, broke the silence again. "Daddy is crying. He's cold. He wants to go home." The murmurs rose into audible fear. An older man, Mr. Donovan, who had known Adam for over 2 decades, furrowed his brow and whispered, "A child that young wouldn't make something like that up. Not over and over. And look at him. He's scared out of his mind." Eliza's heart pounded. She didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it, but Noah's consistency, his pain, it couldn't be coincidence. Then, as if fate had orchestrated it, the church doors flew open again, slamming against the walls with a gust of cold air. A familiar figure stepped in, breathing hard. Matthew, Adam's best friend since childhood. His coat was disheveled, hair tousled, as though he'd run from miles away. "Eliza," he called, eyes darting around until he found her. She turned quickly, startled by the urgency in his voice. "What's going on?" she asked, holding Noah tighter. Matthew moved in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I didn't make it in time, but I just heard from someone at the hospital. There's something you need to know, about Adam, about Daniel." Eliza's stomach tightened. She glanced around nervously. Daniel had left only moments ago. But somehow, she already knew this wouldn't be good. What about him? Adam didn't trust him. Said he kept pressuring him. Hard for weeks to sell the house. Adam refused. He thought something was off. And then, just a day after telling me he'd never give in, he died. Eliza blinked, stunned. Her mouth opened, but no words came. The pieces began clicking into place. Daniel's eagerness to push the sale. His coldness at the funeral. His refusal to even entertain the thought of checking the coffin. Her voice shook. You think Daniel had something to do with this? I can't prove anything, Matthew said, jaw clenched. But Adam was scared. He told me to look out for you and Noah if anything ever happened to him. Eliza's breath caught. Her fingers curled around Noah protectively as the child murmured, Mommy, Daddy's not sleeping. He's scared. He's calling me. And then, something unimaginable happened. A faint, barely audible knock echoed from the direction of the coffin. Thud. The room went still. No one breathed. A woman screamed. Several mourners backed away instinctively. Eliza's knees buckled slightly beneath her. Had she imagined it? But then it came again. Thud. This time louder. Unmistakable. The whispers turned to cries of disbelief. Did you hear that? Was that the coffin? My God. It can't be. Matthew's face turned white. We have to open it, he said, stepping forward. No. A voice boomed from the church entrance. Daniel was back. His face was pale but his eyes burned with fury. No one is opening that coffin. Don't let your emotions spiral into madness. But his words fell flat. His voice cracked. And worse, he was trembling. People noticed. They began to inch away from him. Why are you so afraid of the coffin being opened? Mr. Donovan asked, his voice sharp. If there's nothing to hide, what's the harm in checking? It's disrespectful, Daniel barked. We are at a funeral, not some horror show. And yet, Eliza shot back, stepping forward. You're the only one trying to stop us. Why? Her voice echoed across the sanctuary, laced with both fear and fury. Daniel faltered. His mouth moved, but no words came out. You said Adam had debts. You came here talking about the house before he was even buried. You pushed and pushed. Why? Because it's what's best for... No. Eliza snapped, pointing at him. It's what's best for you. That's what this is about. Isn't it? Money. Control. You were hoping to get rid of him and take everything. You don't know what you're saying. Oh. I know exactly what I'm saying. She interrupted. And you're afraid. Because you know we're going to open that coffin. The knocking came again. Louder. Thud. Thud. It was as if Adam himself was begging them to act. Matthew turned toward the casket. Hands clenched. I'm not waiting any longer. No. Daniel lunged forward, trying to grab his arm. But several men stepped between them. Back off, Mr. Donovan warned. Daniel's eyes darted wildly. He looked like a man cornered. Please, he begged, his voice cracking into something more pitiful than angry. Don't open it. You'll regret it. Eliza's eyes locked with his. And what she saw was no longer grief. It was guilt. It was fear. What did you do to my husband? She asked. Her voice low, trembling. Tell us the truth. Daniel backed away, hands raised, sweat pouring down his forehead. I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would go this far. Matthew's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? And then Daniel broke. I only meant to scare him. I put something in his drink, just enough to knock him out. He was supposed to wake up. But he didn't. A collective gasp filled the room. Eliza's vision blurred as the horror sank in. You poisoned him? I didn't know he was allergic. Daniel cried. I thought he'd just sleep it off. When he didn't wake up, I panicked. I bribed a doctor. Faked the certificate. I thought he was already gone. But before he could say more, thud, thud, the coffin shook again. Matthew turned to Eliza. We need to open it. Now. Daniel screamed, lunging forward. No, you don't understand what you're doing. But no one was listening anymore. Not even the priest, who had stood silently near the altar, now stepped forward, his voice calm and grim. Let the truth be revealed. And so, as the church held its breath, as the cries of a child and the pounding from within the coffin merged into one desperate call, Eliza reached for the lid under the looming arches of St. Helena Church. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. The mourners had gathered to honor the memory of a man they believed was gone. But now everything was unraveling. The air had grown dense. thick with something that felt like dread, or perhaps revelation. A single sound had changed everything. Thud. Faint at first, it had echoed from the direction of the coffin. Subtle enough to be doubted, yet loud enough to unsettle the senses. But when it came again, thud, thud, there was no mistaking it. Every eye in the room snapped to the polished oak casket at the center of the altar. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd, followed by gasps and stifled cries. People backed away, forming a wide circle around the coffin as if it were a living, breathing thing. Eliza stood motionless, holding little Noah close. The child whimpered into her neck, then whispered, "Daddy is knocking." Her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear her own thoughts. She looked at Matthew, who stood beside her with his fists clenched, his jaw rigid. He'd heard it too. They all had. Even Father Malcolm, who had been silent near the altar, made the sign of the cross and stepped cautiously back, and then came the voice, harsh, commanding, panicked. "No one is to touch the coffin." Daniel's shout pierced through the chaos like a blade. He stormed forward, his eyes wide with something raw and uncontained. "You're letting grief turn into hysteria. It's just the wood, expanding from the cold. This is normal." But no one was listening anymore. His words sounded rehearsed, desperate. The cracks in his composure were growing wider by the second. "Mr. Donovan stepped forward, his voice firm, unwavering. "If there's nothing to fear, Daniel, why are you so afraid of opening it?" Daniel's lips curled into a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Because it's disrespectful. He's gone. Let him rest. Or maybe," Matthew said sharply, "you just don't want us to see what's inside." The air turned electric. The knocking came again, louder this time, more urgent. Thud, thud, thud. A woman screamed. Another fainted. Noah clutched his mother's dress, sobbing uncontrollably. "He's scared, Mommy. He says it's dark in there." Eliza took a step forward. Her body trembled, but her mind was crystal clear. "We need to open it," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her chest. "If there's even the slightest chance." "No." Daniel's face contorted in fury as he reached out and grabbed her arm. "You're not opening that coffin. You're insane." His grip was too tight, painful, but Eliza didn't flinch. She stared into his eyes. And for the first time, she saw exactly what he'd been hiding: fear. Not the fear of grief, but of exposure. She ripped her arm away. "Let go of me. You don't understand what you're doing," he roared. "I understand perfectly," she said coldly. "You're trying to bury the truth." Matthew stepped forward and planted himself between Eliza and Daniel. "If you try to stop us again," he growled, "I'll make sure you never set foot in this town again." The room erupted into movement. Several men from the village moved closer to the coffin, while others held Daniel back. Mrs. Whitmore had collapsed into a pew, clutching her rosary tightly, whispering frantic prayers. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God, save us." Daniel thrashed in the arms of two men who restrained him, his face red and sweating. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll regret this. You'll all regret this." But no one was paying attention to him anymore. The knocking intensified. Thud. 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 It reverberated through the stone walls of the church, through the hearts of everyone present. It was no longer a sound. It was a cry for help. Eliza moved slowly toward the coffin, her eyes never leaving it. She placed Noah down gently beside Mrs. Whitmore, who instinctively pulled the boy close. Eliza's hands hovered over the lid. Her breath was short. Her palms were sweating. "I have to do this," she whispered, though it wasn't clear if she was talking to herself or the spirit she prayed wasn't already lost. Father Malcolm took a step forward. "Wait," he said solemnly. "Let us pray first." But Matthew cut him off. "There's no time. Every second counts." With a nod, Eliza placed both hands on the cold wooden lid. She hesitated, just for a moment, and then pushed. The hinges groaned. The lid creaked upward, and at that exact second, a hand burst from inside, reaching toward the light. Screams erupted. Eliza stumbled back, her heart in her throat. It was Adam. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, stared at the ceiling. His lips were dry, cracked. His skin was pale as death itself. But he was alive, barely. "Eliza," he rasped. She dropped to her knees beside the coffin, tears streaming down her face as she grabbed his hand. "Adam, oh my God, you're alive, you're alive." Matthew pulled off his coat and threw it over Adam's trembling body. "Call an ambulance," he shouted. Now, villagers scrambled for their phones. Someone kicked open the church doors to get a signal. Others wept in shock. Some dropped to their knees in prayer. The impossible had become real. He had been buried alive. And if not for a 2-year-old boy's unwavering cries, he would have died forgotten in silence. Noah rushed toward the coffin, throwing his tiny arms around his father's neck. "Daddy, I heard you. I told Mommy. I told everyone." Adam let out a choked sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. He couldn't hold his son, but his eyes locked onto Eliza's. "You believed him?" "I had to," she whispered. "My heart wouldn't let me bury you." Then, behind them, Daniel let out a horrible, guttural scream. "No, he can't be alive. He can't be." He broke free from the men holding him and lunged forward, only to be tackled by Matthew and Mr. Donovan. Fists flew. The church erupted into chaos once more. "You buried him alive," Eliza screamed. "You tried to kill him." Daniel sobbed. "I just wanted the house. I just wanted him out of the way. I didn't know he'd wake up." Sirens wailed in the distance. The police were coming. The nightmare was nearly over when Sheriff Walker arrived with his deputies. Daniel was already on the ground, wrists pinned behind his back. The sheriff looked at the scene. Adam being pulled gently from the coffin, Noah clinging to him, Eliza sobbing in disbelief, and then at Daniel, who was screaming about mistakes and innocence. "You have the right to remain silent," the sheriff said coldly, "and you'd better use it." Daniel was hauled away, kicking and screaming, while an ambulance crew loaded Adam onto a stretcher. Eliza walked beside it, never letting go of his hand. "You came back to me," she whispered. Adam's cracked lips curved into a faint smile. "I never left. You saved me." Noah leaned over the edge of the stretcher, his little face pressed to Adam's. "We're going home, Daddy, all 3 of us." And as the paramedics wheeled Adam out of the church, the sun finally broke through the stained glass windows above, casting golden light over them all. The nightmare had passed, but the truth had risen. A mother's courage, a child's voice, and the heartbeat of a man no one could silence. The paramedics hadn't even arrived yet, but the truth had already begun to unravel, raw and horrifying in front of the entire congregation. As Adam lay trembling in Eliza's arms, his lips parched, eyes flickering between consciousness and darkness, the church filled with a stunned, sacred silence. No one spoke, not even Father Malcolm. The only sounds were Adam's ragged breaths and Noah's quiet sobs as he clung to his father's weak, barely warm hand. And then came a voice, broken, desperate, unraveling. "I didn't mean to kill him." All heads turned to Daniel. He had collapsed on the church floor, his black suit torn at the collar, his face drenched in sweat. His eyes, wide with terror, darted around the room as if searching for somewhere to run. But there was nowhere left. The truth had cornered him. "I just wanted the house," he sobbed, his voice trembling. "I told him to sell it. Again and again. He refused. He kept saying it belonged to Noah, that he wouldn't give it up, not even for me." He looked at Eliza then, eyes pleading, as if she could save him from what he'd done. But she only stared at him, frozen. "So I just meant to scare him," Daniel continued, voice cracking with guilt. "I put something in his drink, something to knock him out for a few hours, just long enough to make him panic, to make him listen. I didn't know, God. I didn't know he was allergic." A wave of shock rippled through the mourners. Murmurs erupted. "He drugged him? What kind of person? That poor man." But Daniel wasn't done. He clutched the base of the altar as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "When I saw he wasn't waking up, I panicked. I thought he was dead. I didn't check. I was too scared. I bribed a doctor, paid him to sign the certificate, told him not to ask questions. I didn't want trouble. I just wanted the house." Eliza's hand flew to her mouth. Her knees nearly buckled. "You buried him alive," she whispered. "You didn't even check?" Daniel shook his head, sobbing uncontrollably. "I swear I thought he was gone. By the time they sealed the coffin, I couldn't think straight. I told myself it was over. I never meant for this to happen." "You never meant?" Matthew's voice exploded from across the room, sharp as glass. He stepped forward, eyes blazing. "You buried a man without even confirming if he was dead. All for a house?" Daniel recoiled. It wasn't supposed to go this far. But it did, Eliza said, stepping closer to her husband. Her voice now firm with resolve. You nearly killed the father of my child. You tried to destroy everything we had. And now you want sympathy? No, Daniel screamed, but no one was listening to him anymore. The villagers turned from him in disgust. Even Father Malcolm stood still, his expression unreadable, save for the faint tremble of his hands as he clutched his prayer book. Just then, a bang echoed outside the church, the sound of emergency doors swinging open. The paramedics finally arrived, rushing through the aisle with their equipment, their eyes widening in disbelief at the surreal scene before them. Adam was alive. Barely but alive. One of them knelt down beside him and began checking his vitals. He's severely dehydrated, the medic muttered. Shallow breathing, but pulse is there. We need to get him to the hospital now. Eliza stepped aside, tears pouring freely down her cheeks as they lifted Adam onto the stretcher. She leaned over him, brushing his damp hair away from his forehead. You're safe now, she whispered. You're coming back to us. Adam blinked slowly, his eyes finding hers. There were no words between them, only the weight of everything unspoken. And in that silence was more love, more sorrow, and more relief than words could hold. As the paramedics wheeled Adam toward the church exit, little Noah rushed forward again, holding his father's hand. I heard you, Daddy, he whispered through tears. I told Mommy. I didn't stop. Adam's lips curled ever so slightly, and though his voice was barely a whisper, Eliza heard it clear as day. You saved me. Behind them, Daniel was on his knees, screaming now, not for mercy, but from madness. The guilt, the unraveling truth, the sight of Adam still breathing, it was all too much for him. Officers who had just arrived moved quickly, securing him in cuffs while the villagers watched in stunned silence. Sheriff Walker looked at Eliza, then at Daniel. He'll be charged. Attempted murder, fraud, tampering with official documents. He won't walk away from this. Eliza said nothing. There was nothing left to say. As they stepped outside, the cold afternoon air met them like a breath of new life. The ambulance doors shut with a final thud, and the vehicle sped away down the winding road toward the nearest hospital. A life had been saved, snatched back from the edge of death. And a crime, almost perfect, had collapsed under the weight of one child's innocence. One small voice had shattered the silence of a lie. And because of that voice, the truth, though nearly buried, rose from the grave. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, every eye locked on the trembling man in shackles at the front. Daniel, once confident and calculating, now sat hunched, pale, and broken. The judge's gavel struck with a sharp crack that echoed like thunder across the marble walls. For the charges of attempted murder, falsification of official documents, and the unlawful burial of a living person, the defendant is hereby sentenced to 25 years in state prison without parole. A gasp rippled through the audience, followed by a stunned silence. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't cry. He simply lowered his head as the bailiffs led him away, chains clinking softly like whispers of justice finally delivered. Among the witnesses sat Eliza, holding little Noah in her lap. Matthew stood beside her, a hand resting protectively on her shoulder, and though the pain of what they'd endured would never fully fade. Today, justice had spoken. 3 weeks later, golden sunlight poured across the front porch of the cottage Adam once feared he'd never see again. He sat there now, frail but alive, wrapped in a blanket as Noah played in the garden nearby, his laughter dancing through the breeze like a song of rebirth. Eliza stepped out with 2 cups of tea, handing one to Adam as she sat beside him. He looked at her, eyes still holding the weight of everything he'd been through, but now softened with peace. I still can't believe I'm here, he whispered. There were moments in that coffin. I didn't think I'd ever see the sky again. Eliza reached over, gently touching his hand. But you did, because you never gave up. Because Noah never stopped believing. Adam's eyes drifted toward their son, now chasing butterflies under the warm sun. He saved me, he said softly. You both did. The days that followed were quiet, peaceful, and filled with the healing that only love can bring. The villagers, once paralyzed by fear and shock, now visited often, bringing warm meals and kind words, as if trying to stitch together what had been torn. Even Father Malcolm came by, offering prayers and gratitude for the miracle they had all witnessed. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills and painted the sky in hues of fire and rose, Eliza stood at the doorway, watching Adam and Noah lying on a blanket in the grass, pointing up at the clouds and naming shapes. A tear slipped down her cheek, not from sorrow, but from overwhelming gratitude. They had been to the edge of hell and returned as a family stronger than ever. This story is not just about a man who survived being buried alive. It's about the love of a mother who trusted her instincts. About a child whose voice refused to be silenced. About justice that took its time, but finally came. It's a reminder that even in the darkest places, truth can still find a way to breathe. That faith, love, and the unwavering bond of family are more powerful than fear, lies, or betrayal. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the strength to bring you more real, emotional stories that remind us all of what truly matters in life. Thank you for watching. And remember, no matter how deep something is buried, the truth always finds a way back to the surface.